Somewhere in Europe, there are iron gates that have stood out in the open for centuries. Through rain, through freezing winters, through seasons that should have slowly pulled them apart. And yet, when you look closer, the surface reacts differently than expected. It doesn't peel the same way. It doesn't break down the same way. It just stays intact. And that's unusual, because iron isn't meant to endure like that. If you leave modern steel outside long enough, the outcome is familiar. The surface begins to deteriorate. Layers start separating, small fractures form, and over time, everything weakens along a pattern we already understand, almost like it's following instructions. But these older pieces, they don't seem to follow those instructions. The edges are still there, softened, but not gone. The form remains in a way that's hard to explain by simply saying it lasted, because survival usually leaves clearer damage, more obvious breakdown, and yet here, something feels slowed down, almost as if the material itself is aging in a different way, which doesn't really make sense. And yet, it keeps happening. You begin to notice the same thing elsewhere. Old tools, hinges, chains left behind in forgotten structures. Objects that were never preserved, never considered important, and still, they remain. Not untouched, but not failing the way we would expect today. So the question shifts. It's no longer just why they survived. It's why they seem to break down differently. Because if the material is technically the same, iron is still iron, then something else must have changed. Maybe it was the way it was made, or maybe it was never just about the material. And that's where things start to feel slightly off. Because the more you look at it, the less it feels like a simple comparison between old and new, and more like two completely different ways of understanding how something is supposed to last. But resisting time might not even be the strangest part. But then you come across something even harder to ignore. Because it's not just that these older pieces last, it's how modern ones fail right next to them. In some cities, you can still find original iron fixtures built into structures that are hundreds of years old, and right beside them, newer replacements, installed just decades ago, already showing deeper corrosion, more aggressive damage, almost as if time is moving faster for them. And that doesn't make sense. Because modern metallurgy is supposed to be more controlled, more refined, every variable measured, every impurity reduced. We don't leave things to chance anymore. And yet, these improvements seem to come with a strange side effect. The material becomes more predictable, but also more fragile in ways that are harder to see at first. You notice how modern steel tends to fail cleanly. When it breaks completely. No warning, no slow adaptation, just a sudden loss of integrity. But older iron, it doesn't behave like that. It bends, it resists, it deforms before it gives up. Almost like it's negotiating with stress instead of obeying it, which is strange. Because by modern standards, that kind of inconsistency would be considered a flaw. And yet, that flaw might be exactly what kept it alive. There are records of historical structures where components were never perfectly uniform, each piece slightly different, shaped by hand, adjusted by feel rather than formula. And somehow, those imperfections didn't weaken the system. They stabilized it. Because when stress moves through something too perfect, it travels cleanly, directly. And sometimes, that's exactly what causes it to break. But when a structure is irregular, when nothing aligns perfectly, the force gets interrupted, scattered, absorbed in ways that are harder to predict, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. That in trying to eliminate imperfection, we may have also removed something that once made materials more resilient. And if that's true, then what we call progress might not just be about gaining control. It might also be about losing a kind of tolerance we no longer understand. But that leads to a deeper question. If the material didn't change as much as we think, then maybe the real difference wasn't in the iron at all. And that's where the focus begins to shift, away from the material itself and toward the people who shaped it. Because iron, on its own, doesn't decide how it behaves. It only responds to the way it's treated, the heat it's given, the rhythm it's worked under, the moment it's allowed to cool. And for most of history, none of that lived in a manual. It lived in hands. We tend to imagine knowledge as something written down, stored, organized, passed through systems. But for a very long time, it didn't work like that. A blacksmith wouldn't describe temperature in numbers. He would feel it. Read the color, the sound, the resistance under the hammer. Small signals that don't translate easily into words. And that's where things become difficult to track. Because once that kind of knowledge disappears, it doesn't leave a clear record of what was lost. Only a gap. A quiet absence that's easy to overlook. There are accounts of craftsmen adjusting each piece slightly, not because they lacked precision, but because they were responding to something in the material itself, something that changed from piece to piece, batch to batch, something that couldn't be standardized without losing it entirely. Which is strange, because today, variation is something we try to eliminate. We aim for consistency, repeatability, exact replication, and in doing so, we remove the need for interpretation, the need to read the material in front of you. But maybe that interpretation was never just an extra step. Maybe it was the process. Because when knowledge sits in the body, in experience, it adapts in real time. It corrects small differences before they become problems. It allows for a kind of flexibility that rigid systems can't easily reproduce. And yet, that kind of knowledge is slow. It doesn't scale well. It depends on time, on apprenticeship, on repetition, and over time, it gets replaced. Not because it stops working, but because something faster takes its place. Which leads to a quiet trade, one that doesn't feel obvious at first. We gain speed, we gain control, we gain the ability to produce more, faster, and with fewer variables. But we lose something harder to define, a sensitivity, an awareness of when something is slightly off, before it becomes a failure. And maybe that's why these older materials feel different, not just because of what they are, but because of the kind of attention they were made with. But if that's true, then the difference we're seeing today might not be a mystery of materials at all. It might be a reflection of what happens when knowledge stops living in hands. And when that shift happens, the consequences don't arrive all at once. They show up slowly, in ways that feel almost reasonable at first. Because modern systems are not trying to last forever. They are trying to perform, to meet a requirement, pass a test, survive a defined lifespan. And beyond that point, failure is no longer unexpected. It's assumed, which is a very different idea of durability. You see it in how things are built today, not to adapt, not to age gradually, but to function perfectly, until they don't. And when they fail completely. Clean, efficient, final. But older objects, they seem to resist that kind of ending. They degrade, they shift, they weaken in ways that can be seen, felt, sometimes even corrected, as if they were never meant to be perfect, only to endure. And that difference, it changes everything. Because once you design for perfection, you also design for a precise point of collapse. There's no room for negotiation. No space for adjustment, only a narrow path between working and not working. And yet, when something is built with variation, with small inconsistencies, it carries a kind of tolerance inside it, a buffer against stress, against time, against the unexpected, which is slower, less efficient, harder to control, but it lasts. And that's where the trade begins to feel real. We didn't just gain better tools, we changed what we consider good. We chose speed over patience, uniformity over sensitivity, replacement over repair. And none of that is necessarily wrong, but it comes at a cost. Because the more predictable a system becomes, the less forgiving it is. And maybe that's the part we don't always see. That in removing imperfection, we may have also removed resilience. In chasing control, we may have lost a certain kind of understanding. And the result isn't that modern materials are weaker, it's that they live differently. Shorter cycles, sharper endings, cleaner failures, while the past seems to linger. Not perfect, not untouched, but still here, which leaves a question that doesn't resolve easily. Are we building things to last?